All right, let's get started. Hi, everyone. My name is Mardi, and I'm the president of the University of Sussex Scientific Society. The Scientific Society is a new student group at Sussex, created to bring cutting-edge research and world-leading scientists to Sussex to explore the leading scientific issues of the day. With that in mind, we're absolutely delighted to be hosting Dr. Aubrey de Grey as our inaugural speaker. Dr. de Grey is the Chief Scientific Officer of SENS Research Foundation and Vice President at AgeX Therapeutics, as well as Editor-in-Chief of the medical journal Rejuvenation Research. One of the world's foremost gerontologists, Dr. de Grey is now a pioneer in the field of aging, revolutionizing the way that we view aging and providing new and innovative strategies to fight it. I'm going to pass it on to my co-host for the night, Elisa Che, who will describe the format for this evening's event.
Thank you very much, Madi. Hi, everyone. My name is Elisa, and I am the Vice President of the Scientific Society. So today's event is co-hosted by the SENS Research Society and the University of Sussex Biomed Society. I just wanted to quickly run you through the format of the event, and it will involve a 40-minute talk given by Aubrey. And this will be followed by a 15-minute Q&A session. So Mari and I have prepared a few questions, but the main purpose of this session is for you in the audience to get involved and for you to ask your questions. So if you have any questions at all, we encourage you to submit them in the chat box below. And yeah, I guess that's all for me and Madi. And so Aubrey, the floor is yours.
All right, thank you. Let me just share my screen and good, and do that. So could somebody please confirm that they can see my title slide?
Yep, we can see your slide.
Rock and roll. Okay, here we go. So thank you very much for that very kind introduction. It's a delight to be here. I'm fairly sure I've never spoken in Sussex before, so this is very nice for me. I do want to say something to kind of amplify what Mari said in the introduction, because it's actually quite important. And what actually triggered me was that I wouldn't really call rejuvenation research a medical journal. It's more for PhDs than MDs. It's more about stuff that doesn't yet exist. And that's quite an important thing for me personally, because really what I've tried to do over the past 20, 25 years as I've been working in this field is to work at the interface between the research community and the medical community in relation to aging. That's an interface that is still, I would say, underpopulated, though much less so than it used to be. People who are not trying to actually use what we can do already for the betterment of mankind, but who are also not just doing, if you like, curiosity-driven, finding out about aging for the sake of finding it out, but rather kind of bridging between the two and using what we already know as the starting point to design new interventions that don't yet exist and that can potentially do better than what does exist. So I historically would call myself a biomedical gerontologist, with the emphasis on the bio, but also on the medical. And this was a term that was actually introduced way back in, I'm going to say 1985, by one of my heroes, Denham Harmon. Okay, so here we go. This is what I'm going to, of course, I appreciate that there may be quite a spectrum of prior knowledge among the audience about what I do, what my organization does. And therefore, I'm going to spend a little bit of time on background, but since I have 40 minutes, I'm going to kind of divide that time between background and recent updates, so to speak. And I'm also going to spend a few minutes on the relevance of COVID to all of this, because the relevance is not just that, aging is bad for old people. I'm sorry, COVID is bad for old people, but also that COVID may be good for research in this area. So I'm going to start, and I especially like to emphasize this to non-scientific audiences, but I think it's also important for everybody, by telling you what I don't work on. And this is critical, because I have to, those of you who know my work will know that I don't just run the science of a foundation. I also spend a huge amount of my time on stage and on camera and generally doing outreach to the world. And I spend my entire life having to remind people that I am not what I am often called in the media, like, you know, the prophet of immortality or whatever. That actually I don't work on longevity at all. I work on health. I do medical research, just like any other medical researcher. And I think we all need to remember always that longevity is simply a side effect of health. It is something that happens as a side effect simply because most people die from being sick. And of course, the health problems of late life are by far the majority of health problems that are still present in the industrialized world. Therefore, if we make progress against those health problems, then the magnitude of the longevity side effect is likely to be quite substantial. And we certainly think that's a good thing, but it's still a side effect, which means that this kind of nonsense is complete nonsense. The kind of thing I have to contend with whenever I speak to a journalist is the stuff on the left here. You know, oh dear, well, we put all the people, or, you know, doesn't death give meaning to life, or, you know, won't dictators live forever? And I have to constantly remind people that actually, you know, we've got quite a bad problem today, this problem of everyone getting sick when they've been born a long time ago. And the amount of suffering that that causes is really quite substantial. And therefore, you know, when we address these other problems, we have to think, well, okay, is it actually better just to leave things as they are and not risk creating these new problems? That's bullshit. You know, we actually have perfectly good ways to avoid these things on the left anyway. But even if we didn't, it would still make no sense to put up with the astronomical amount of suffering that exists today. So I always, you know, have to preface my remarks with that point. All right, so now for the real talk. I believe that in order to be systematic as a technologist of any kind, and of course medicine is a branch of technology, in order to be systematic, one needs to start by asking the right question. And this, to my mind, is the right question to start from when we look at the challenge of developing medicines to keep elderly people healthy. It's a question that isn't asked enough, quite honestly. The question is, what is so different about the health problems of late life? How come that over the past 200 years, we have been so extraordinarily successful in bearing down on the health problems that used to kill people early in life, and they haven't worked on the health problems of late life? You know, I mean, remember the numbers here. Many of you will know these numbers more or less. 200 years ago, more than 1/3 of babies in the UK or in any wealthy country would die before the age of 1. More than 1/3. And, you know, huge numbers of people would die in childbirth and so on. And we solved all that just by these ridiculously elementary measures, like, you know, just figuring out that hygiene is a good idea. And, you know, these really simple medicines like vaccines and antibiotics, even mosquito nets, right? And of course, now we're seeing huge amounts of progress in the developing world in the same way. So that's all wonderful. But what is so different about the health problems of late life? Well, most people, I think a large part of why the question is not asked often enough is that most people think they know the answer. This is the answer. Of course, you're not supposed to be able to read this slide. I'm just, you know, trying to communicate that there are so many things that go wrong with us late in life. And of course, they go wrong at more or less the same time, which means that they, you know, they interact with each other, they exacerbate each other. So it's very reasonable to suppose that the fundamental reason is just complexity, that the sheer complexity of the problem of health in late life is so huge that it has overwhelmed the ability of the medical profession to get on top of it. And I'm not saying that that's completely not the answer. That certainly is part of the answer, but actually it's not the main part. So I really want to emphasize what the main part is before I really get going. And it starts from a definition of aging. Now, here's another crazy thing, right? I mean, if you ask 10 people, even 10 biologists, what aging is, you will get 10 different answers, which is completely embarrassing. I mean, aging has been the #1 preoccupation of the human race since the beginning of civilization. And yet here we are without an agreed definition of it. It's bullshit. Why should this be? So here's my definition, and I'm giving you this definition for 2 reasons. First of all, so that we're all on the same page for the rest of this talk, but also because this is a very useful definition. It's one that demystifies aging. Huge numbers of people, even biologists, believe that aging is some kind of huge enigma that we just totally don't understand, and that therefore, you know, it's appropriate not even to think about doing anything about it yet, but just, we'd like to understand it better first. And then maybe sometime in the arbitrarily distant future, we would think about actually fixing it. Not true at all. We do understand what aging is. Aging is simply the combination of two processes, which I'm depicting in this little diagram here. First of all, there is the left-hand one, where metabolism generates damage. So of course here, when I say metabolism, I do not just mean oxidative metabolism, as in the term metabolic rate. I mean the entire network of processes that keeps us alive from one day to the next. And throughout life, even starting before we're born, metabolism generates changes to the molecular and cellular structure of the body and its composition. And that is all that lifelong process really is. So the first question that comes up, of course, is why is it appropriate to use the word damage to denote those changes? And the answer, of course, is that the body is set up to tolerate a certain amount of those changes, but only a certain amount. And they accumulate over time, so eventually that threshold level is exceeded, and that's when the right-hand process kicks off. The right-hand process is a process of progressive decline of mental and physical function, the pathologies of late life, which of course justifies the word damage as the thing that causes them. But it's only in late life because of this threshold, because the body is set up to tolerate a certain amount of damage without any significant decline in mental or physical function. So that's all that aging is, those two processes. So why have I belabored that so much? Well, fundamentally it's because of this. If you go out and you ask people, and again, I have to include most biologists here, if you ask people the question, in what ways can somebody be sick? Then by and large, the answer you will get will be along the lines of the table I'm showing you here. They will say, well, okay, first of all, there's infections, that's column 1. Then there's column 2, that's the genetic diseases that a few of us inherit. Then there's the big one, the chronic progressive diseases of late life, like Alzheimer's, almost all cancers, heart disease, all the things I put up in terribly small here on. And then most people would say that way out in the stratosphere, there's this fourth category of ways to be sick called aging itself, which consists of these rather poorly defined concepts like frailty, and which is viewed implicitly as so completely different from any kind of disease that implicitly it's kind of off limits to medicine, and it's just kind of universal and natural and inevitable and just go away, don't think about doing anything about it. That is the misconception that is so prevalent in society. And what it has led to is this. It has led to the overwhelming majority of money and time and effort that goes into trying to keep people healthy late in life being misdirected, being directed at what I'm going to just call geriatrics, by which I mean simply trying to pretend that the only things we can actually do about the pathologies of late life are the things in column 3, not the things in column 4. And furthermore, that the way in which we will do something about those things is essentially by attacking them directly as if they were infections, as if they were just like column 1. That's really what we do, if you think about it. We try to cure Alzheimer's disease. I mean, honestly, what the fuck? It's so obviously brain dead, because these pathologies of late life are side effects of being alive. Hello, they are obviously going to become progressively more difficult to prevent as damage accumulates, damage the thing that causes them. So anything that comes under the heading of geriatrics is by definition virtually, it's going to become progressively less effective as the person gets older. It's just insane that that's all we try to do. Okay, now, what's wrong with that idea? Well, this is what's wrong, of course. If you look at this, which is a revised and corrected version of the table I showed you a couple of slides ago, then you can see that actually it's very similar. All the 4 columns are exactly the same, in fact. The only thing I have done is I've moved the big thick black line. And that denotes the 2 problems with the first version. First of all, it shows you that there is no reason to suppose that column 3 can be addressed in the same way that we addressed column 1 so successfully. And secondly, it emphasizes that there is basically no difference between column 3 and column 4. In fact, there really is no biological difference. The difference is purely semantic, that column 3 consists of the aspects of aging that we have chosen to give disease-like names to, and that is all. Which, of course, first of all, gives a complete lie to the idea that the things in column 4 are off limits to medicine, because the things in column 3 certainly aren't. So that's a very important correction to emphasize. Now, the thing is, I'm not the first person to realize what I've told you so far. What I've told you so far is more or less what was going on in the heads of people more than a century ago who essentially created the field of gerontology by saying, well, look, you know, geriatrics is just not going to work. We need to be more preventative if we want to keep elderly people healthy. They took their inspiration back then from the living world, from the fact that in the living world, we see an enormous amount of variation between different species in terms of, you know, how rapidly they age, how rapidly their metabolism generates damage. And that's critical to bear in mind because, of course, it implies that there's a chance that if we study that variation really, really hard, eventually we might come up with some kind of sufficient understanding of it that we could actually, you know, translate that understanding into some kind of therapeutic modality to slow down, to make metabolism run more cleanly in human beings, and thereby generate damage more slowly and postpone the age at which that damage reaches the pathogenic threshold. So, you know, one problem with that that's obvious is that we'd better start such therapies, if we were to be able to develop them, we'd better start them really early in life. Because if you start them on someone who's already in middle age and they've already got most of the damage that they need to have in order to get sick, then you're not going to gain very much. But the second problem, of course, is rather more profound. It is something that all of you are very aware of. Metabolism is just a little bit complicated. In fact, it's really complicated. So this, as I'm sure you recognize, is part of a biochemical chart. It's a simplified diagram of a small subset of what we know about how metabolism actually works. And well, you know, I used to be a programmer before I was a biologist, so I often like to point out to anyone who's ever written software that this is the it's the ultimate nightmare of uncommented spaghetti code. There is absolutely no way in God's earth that we are ever going to be able to disentangle it to the point of being able to stop it from doing the thing we don't want it to do, the creation of damage, without at the same time stopping it from things we need it to do to keep us alive. It's just like it's a non-starter. And of course, I'm understating the severity of the problem here, because really the problem is not so much that this is a simplified diagram of a small subset of what we know about how the body works, but rather that it's a simplified diagram of a small subset of what we know about how the body works, which is completely dwarfed, as I'm sure all of you appreciate, by the completely astronomical amount that we don't know about how the body works. And that's even ignoring all the stuff that we don't even know that we don't know. So, you know, forget it. But luckily, there is a third way. Let's go back to my definition of aging. The definition is metabolism causes damage and damage thereafter causes pathology. And the goal here, our goal as biomedical researchers, is to separate metabolism from pathology, to allow people to carry on performing metabolism, in other words, you know, being alive, without eventually exhibiting pathology. And we've so far looked at two alternative ways to break that link between metabolism and pathology. One is to break the link between damage and pathology, and we see that that's not going to happen. Second one is to break the link between metabolism and damage, and we see that that's also not going to happen. And to be perfectly honest, by the time, well, way before I came along, like the 1970s maybe, people who studied the biology of aging had come to appreciate what I've told you so far. They had come to realize that this just was a non-starter, and they'd given up. Back then, literally, it was the kiss of death to even mention the possibility of intervention in aging in a grant application. You just would not do it. Gerontology had become a bit like seismology. You know, people understand that the thing they're studying is bad for you, but they have no aspiration at all to doing anything about it, like ever, right? It's like, that's how it was, literally, I'm not exaggerating. But there is this third approach, and for whatever reason, I was the first person to come along and really identify and promote and explain it. And I'm calling it here the maintenance approach. You could call it simply the damage repair approach. What it says is, well, hang on, we can leave both of the component processes alone and we can still get the goal of separating metabolism from pathology. All we need to do is prevent the damage from accumulating. And all that takes is repairing the damage. You don't even have to repair it perfectly. You just need to go in and periodically repair most of it so that the overall amount of damage that the body is carrying around remains below that tolerable threshold. It's the entirety of the idea. And to be honest, It's the main thing that I'm well known for. 20 years ago, I came along and said this, and people didn't understand a word that I was saying at first, but they certainly do now. The reason I'm so arrogant as to call it the common sense approach is this: we already do it. The body ultimately is a machine. It's a really, really complicated machine, but it's still a machine. In other words, its function is determined by its structure. And that means that we simply do not need to think beyond what we already successfully do to simple man-made machines. So here is one such machine. It's obviously a vintage car. It's more than 100 years old. And it's working just as well as when it was built. But the key point is it was not designed to last 100 years. It was designed to last 10 years, or so, 15 at the outside, right? And here it is. How come? Simply because it got lucky and it was bought and owned over the years by people who chose to do an unusually comprehensive job of preventative maintenance on it, to get rid of the rust and all that before the doors fall off. That's all. Most people are lazy and they don't do that. They're perfectly happy to buy a new car, so they only do the amount of maintenance on their cars that the law requires. But some cars get lucky, and this is one such car. So to summarize what I've told you so far, aging is not some kind of emergent phenomenon of biology, you know, like consciousness. It is basically a phenomenon of physics. Comprehensive maintenance ought to work just as well for a living machine as it does for an inanimate machine. So the only thing that I have not yet discussed with you is the complexity of damage. What we have so far is the knowledge that the metabolism, the functioning of the machine that we call the human body, is viciously complicated. And we also know that the eventual late life pathologies of the human body are viciously complicated. So, pessimistically, we might fear that the thing in the middle, the damage, is also comparably complicated, which would mean that yes, the damage repair approach is the common sense approach, but so what? Because it's still way impractical. It's just not going to happen. And the reason why I started to get quite hopeful about this approach 20 years ago and why I have pushed it so hard is fundamentally that it turns out that that's not the case, that damage is not nearly so complicated as that, and in fact, it is manageable. I'll come back to that slide, that other slide in a moment. This is damage. The things on the left are categories of damage, and as you see, there are only 7 of them. Now, of course, there are many, many, many different types of damage, but this classification of them is quite manageable. You know, 7's a manageable number. So you may ask, you know, what is this classification all for? It is ultimately in order to guide us in developing the damage repair therapies, the maintenance approaches, which are listed, of course, on the right. And the reason it does guide us is because there's only one thing in each row on the right. In other words, for each category of damage, there is one generic approach to repairing that damage. So for illustration, let me just highlight the first one, cell loss. What is that? It's simply cells dying and not being replaced by the division and differentiation of other cells. And of course, we all know what the repair strategy is there. We know that the damage is simply the progressive loss of cells and eventually the arrival of a situation where the number of cells that is left is not enough for the affected organ to do its job. And the fix is to put those cells back artificially using stem cells that will divide and differentiate to replace the cells that the body's not replacing on its own as a result of having been prepared in the lab before we injected them into being the right kind of stem cell. There are already clinical trials going on for some examples of that within aging. Probably the most conspicuous example is Parkinson's disease, which of course is caused by the relatively rapid loss of one particular type of neuron, dopaminergic neurons, in one particular place, the substantia nigra. Because it's only one type of neuron and because it's only in one place, stem cell therapy is technically not all that difficult. And indeed, when it was tried first, nearly 30 years ago now, it worked spectacularly well when it worked at all. The only reason it only occasionally worked at all was because people didn't know how to manipulate stem cells in the lab back then, and so they had to guess by using cells taken from roughly the right part of the brain of an aborted fetus. But now, of course, we don't have that problem. We've got IPS and so on. So that people are very happy now, very optimistic now. Now, before I go on, I did want to come back to this slide because you guys are biologists and you have probably heard of something that on its face looks like a challenge to my assertion that messing with our metabolism and making our metabolism run more cleanly is too hard. It's intractable because metabolism is so complicated and the creation of damage is so intrinsically embedded within it. The exception, of course, is the rather reliable increase in longevity that we see in the laboratory in pretty much any organism when we impose famine on them, when we limit the number of calories that we give. This is a phenomenon that was discovered about a century ago, and it works not exactly every time, but more or less. Now, of course, people like eating, people enjoy eating, so we need to do better than that if we want to mimic this approach for humans, but that turns out to be possible. It's possible to identify drugs that will go in and essentially trick the body into thinking it's short of calories. And sure enough, the gene expression patterns that are elicited by such drugs work. They are, resembling the gene expression changes that occur in actual famine. Wonderful. And yes, it doesn't produce we would not expect it to produce such enormous impact as we could get from bona fide damage repair, in other words, rejuvenation, but it's definitely better than nothing. The big problem, though, is when we look at humans as opposed to laboratory organisms, it's only very slightly better than nothing. It turns out and we have data on this from many, many years of research, and we also have good evolutionary theory behind it. Turns out that long-lived organisms benefit far less from calorie restriction than short-lived organisms do. So in fact, we cannot regard this even as a big, big step forward, let alone as the Holy Grail. I just wanted to emphasize that to this audience. All right, so back to here. Now, I could go through all these other types of damage and the corresponding repair therapies, but I want to get done by 10 minutes from now, so I still leave plenty of time for questions. So I won't do that. I will just let you know that the reason we set up SENS Research Foundation was because all those other 6 types of damage repair that I had come to the conclusion we should be pursuing were being neglected. One way or another, people thought they weren't possible, or they thought they weren't important, or they didn't understand them in the first place. And so we had to get in there ourselves. And so I created this foundation, which is funded entirely by philanthropy. And I'm very proud to say that we've made great progress in this. But the first part of progress, so here's some of our progress. This is just a small selection of the papers that we have published over the past several years. And we're very proud. These ones in particular, I'm particularly proud of because we can say that these are real, category opening advances. We made steps forward here that allowed other researchers to believe that this was a promising area to get into. And so we kind of kickstarted whole research themes that had previously been completely stagnant. We're very proud of that. But yes, I also wanted to emphasize this. The whole idea of damage repair, I think I mentioned maybe 10 minutes ago, when I first started talking about it way back almost 20 years ago, people didn't really have the faintest idea what I was talking about, and they thought I was being unscientific, and it was quite hard to get people to pay attention. But over those years, I plugged away and explained myself, and we made a little bit of progress here and there. And the long and short of it was after another several years, people kind of got it. And the real demonstration of that was the end of that whole period was in 2013 when this paper came out. In Cell, written by very established people, and it's an exact restatement of what I said 10 years earlier. They split aging into 9 categories rather than 7, but that's not because they identified things I hadn't thought of. It was just like, a different way of doing the subdividing. And you've got the corresponding repair therapies on the right there. Now, as you see, 2,500 sites, this was by far the most highly cited paper in the whole of the biology of aging in the past decade. And furthermore, the citations were all of the form like, they were all in the introduction. They would all be like, hello, here is what we work on. You may be wondering whether what we work on is important or interesting. Well, it was talked about in this one paper from 2013. And that paper is Holy Scripture. Therefore, yes, please keep reading and give us more money. It's all like that. Holy Scripture is not an exaggeration. This is the Bible of the field right now. I just want to briefly mention, even though you guys are students, where we are in terms of commercializing all of this. And this is really important because at the end of the day, investors tend to write much bigger checks than donors do. So pushing this forward into the private sector is absolutely critical for maximizing the speed of everything. At the end of the day, everything that goes on in the non-profit sector, whether it's funded by philanthropy like my foundation, or whether it's academic research funded by governments, it's always desperately underfunded, and the rate of progress is limited by that. It's not limited by the difficulty of the science. That more or less ceases to be true when something moves into startupville. And so we have now at my foundation, which is a charity, we now have a business model where essentially we work on projects for as long as it takes to get them to a point where investors get slightly interested. And it's usually only the very most courageous angel investors at first, of course, but that's fine. And we spin them out of startup companies and they get much better funded and the science starts to move faster. So this is half a dozen companies that we have spun out. This is a ludicrously incomplete list of companies that have emerged in the rejuvenation sector over the past few years, independently of us, but doing very closely aligned work. About 2 years ago, probably, I just gave up trying to keep this slide up to date. There's a couple of hundred companies of this sort now. If you're interested in that, I recommend this website I've linked to at the bottom right of this slide. But I thought I would just end with the last few minutes talking about COVID, because of course COVID is a great exception to the point I began the talk with, that we have brought infectious diseases under comprehensive control. There are, of course, exceptions to that, and COVID is the one of the moment. A big thing I want to point out here that comes under really the political aspect of all of this is that public money is prioritized by our elected representatives. And that is the point. There is only one thing that our elected representatives really care about, and that's getting re-elected, which means they have to believe that there are votes in the thing that they are choosing to put taxpayers' money into. And aging research is unique among humanitarian crusades worldwide in that the people who are at the sharp end of what we want to fix, of the problem we want to fix, just don't complain enough. The elderly, if you ask them, where should we put medical research dollars or pounds, they'll say, oh, give them to medical research for the young because the young have got more to gain. And it's rather hard to communicate that argument is completely circular. But there it is. So now what we have is the additional string to our bow politically, that the younger generation are putting up with lockdowns and social distancing and all that, with unimaginably onerous limitations on their way of life, even though they themselves are at negligible risk from this disease. They're doing it in order to protect the elderly. So that is something that politicians really need to understand. Of course, much more than that, there's the enormous economic aspect too that the governments need to understand, that money spent now on infrastructure, on research and so on, is the way to most efficiently prevent the next pandemic, or indeed to minimize its impact as and when it turns up. And quite soon now, the minds of policymakers and decision makers worldwide are going to start shifting from the immediate priority of ending this pandemic towards that question of how do we minimize the next one. So any of you who either have friends or parents or anything like that who have political connections, who are maybe in parliament themselves, these are the people who really need right now to be hearing this message and understanding that research in rejuvenating not only the immune system but the health in general of the elderly is going really well. It is no longer possible to view it as science fiction, and therefore more money thrown at it will accelerate the rate at which will hasten the date at which we truly start to protect the elderly from the health problems that they currently suffer, including the next pandemic. So I'll stop there and just mention that several years ago I wrote this book, which discusses all of the science of categories of aging damage, ways to fix them. I'm very proud to say that I have not felt the need to write a sequel, because the fact is, even though there has been a huge amount of progress over the past decade since I wrote this book, nevertheless, that progress has pretty much entirely been what we predicted that it would be. The only surprises that have happened have been good surprises, like the emergence of, CRISPR and IPS and such like. The overall paradigm is standing the test of time. There are no more types of damage that we've discovered. There are no more reasons to believe that our repair strategies won't work. So it looks as though it's going to carry on standing the test of time. And I'll stop there and I'll be happy to take questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Aubrey. That was really, really interesting. And I can see that we've got quite a lot of audience questions coming in. So before we get to that, I actually have one or two of my own, and I think Elisa's got one as well. Then we'll move over there. But I guess where to start? So I think the first one I'd look at is, I'm quite interested in public health policy. And, when you start looking at things like pandemics, you then get into conversations about things like global population, what's sustainable. And I know that's something that you've talked about a lot and something that you're not always, the biggest fan of addressing, because, I think like you, I share a sort of a Bose-Ruppian view on something like carrying capacity, that when you have the need, you'll innovate, and the innovate lets you increase the global population without kind of any of the perceived risks of unsustainability. But I guess my question relates more to sort of equity and access. Would these sorts of treatments, I know it's not limited just to one company, but when these emerge, would they be more concentrated in countries where there are higher socioeconomic backgrounds and classes where they can afford it, and would other continents and countries be left behind? And how would you go about maybe mitigating that?
Sure, it's a great question. So I really ought to emphasize, perhaps I didn't say this quite enough at the beginning, that I do not think that these questions are invalid or stupid questions at all. Questions like, where we put all the people, or won't it be only for the rich, or whatever. My frustration is that I've been answering them for like 15 years on high profile media, worldwide. And it's still that people just seem to let the answers go in one ear and out the other, as if they don't want there to be answers, so that they can carry on believing that aging is some kind of blessing in disguise and we shouldn't think about it. So as not to get their hopes up, is the way I see it. Okay, so let me just give the actual answers to the overpopulation question and the equity of access problem, because those are the two most common ones that come up. The overpopulation one does not rely on reaction. It does not say, okay, if we start to have an overpopulation problem, we will innovate and so on. The fact is, we've already got an overpopulation problem, as demonstrated by climate change, and we are already innovating to fix it. And indeed, not even just to fix it, we're innovating, and the fix is a side benefit of the fix. So, of course, the best example of that is renewable energy. We are seeing constant technological improvements in solar energy and wind energy, especially, that are reducing the cost per kilowatt of production of this energy. And we're now down in the same range as fossil fuels, and the improvements are continuing. So we know for sure that it will no longer need people to actually, care about climate change to solve this problem. It's going to happen simply because people like to have lower electricity bills. And of course, the same is true across all the other aspects of how having a lot of people causes environmental problem, whether it's artificial meat, which will, within a decade be both cheaper and tastier than regular meat, and thus will remove the greenhouse gas production problem from agriculture. We could go on. We could go talk about desalination. We could talk about, bacteria that eat plastics. Essentially, all we have to remember is that these technologies are already coming, even though we haven't yet decided that we really care about the problem. Using it as a reason not to develop medicines to solve the enormous amount of suffering caused by aging is just brain dead. But you have to actually, remember that in order to, and then when it comes to inequality of access, there's an equally good answer. So you don't need to lean on the humanitarian imperative and say, well, look, health is a human right, therefore we will do it. Because we all know that, things that are humanitarian imperative don't necessarily happen. We don't even need to lean on the electoral argument that says, it'll be impossible to get elected unless you have a manifesto commitment to have a war on aging and make everything available to everybody. Because we all know that, elections don't always go quite the way we expected either. But what we can lean on is the economic imperative. The fact that aging is just unbelievably, I mean, you think COVID's expensive, aging is far more expensive than COVID. It costs, I mean, the overwhelming majority of the medical budget of any industrialized country goes on the health problems of late life. But far bigger than that is the indirect cost. The fact that the kids of the elderly are less productive because they have to spend so much of their time looking after their sick parents. And of course, overwhelmingly, the fact that the elderly themselves are not able to continue to contribute wealth to society. So the savings that would accrue from helping the elderly not to get sick in the first place would be like, you know, completely astronomical. And this means that any country, you know, if they chose not to make these things free at the point of delivery, irrespective of ability to pay, they would be bankrupt. They would just be economically suicidal. These medicines, you know, to put it in another way, these medicines will pay for themselves many times over incredibly quickly. And of course, we've got time for governments to work that out, to actually understand that argument, because the medicines don't yet exist. And they won't exist probably for another 15 years in the, you know, full-blown form. So there's plenty of time for governments to get their act together and understand this logic and do the, you know, front loading of investment in infrastructure and medical personnel and so on that would be required. Now, of course, if we go to the developing world where, you know, these countries are poor, the question is more complicated. No question about that. I agree with that. But 15 years from now, the most populous countries of the developing world, it will not be appropriate to call them developing anymore. You know, we see just now that you know, the biggest countries, China, India, Brazil, Indonesia, you know, these countries are, if you just measure it in terms of life expectancy, they are easily at the point already where aging is their #1 health problem, right? Because they have sufficiently solved the early life death problem already. So, and they're certainly wealthy enough. Even if we look at the very bottom of the spectrum, you know, if you look at life expectancy worldwide, there are for the past 5 years, there have been 0 countries in the world that have a life expectancy lower than 50. If you exclude sub-Saharan Africa, you can say 60. 0 countries that are lower than 60 life expectancy. So, you know, yes, it's a problem. Yes, and the big reason for optimism there actually is HIV. The fact that sub-Saharan Africa now has access to antiretrovirals, you know, at a price that they can distribute to their population. Now, of course, it took, you know, horrifyingly long for governments to put the right amount of pressure on Big Pharma to make that happen. But the thing is, it did happen, and anything that happens once happens the second time much more quickly. So I'm fairly optimistic about that as well.
Okay, thank you very much. That was really interesting. I can see we have a question in the audience from Anna, which is similar to something I wanted to personally ask you. So as you mentioned, some rejuvenation and some regenerative medicines and therapies are already in clinical trial, and that sounds really exciting. But what kinds of therapies are being tested right now, and what's the timeline for these types of, you know, therapies and medical interventions? And when do you think they'll be available to the public?
Sure. So because we have so many different types of damage that accumulate in the body, the whole damage repair approach is kind of by definition a divide and conquer approach, where we've got to develop a bunch of different therapies and apply them all to the same people at the same time. And of course, different therapies have different degrees of difficulty in terms of how to develop them in the first place. So at this point, we are just at the beginning where some of the easiest therapies are in clinical trials. Some of the stem cell therapies, we've also got therapies to kill off what are called senescent cells, cells that get into this aberrant state where they, you know, they do more harm than good, but they are somehow resistant to being killed off by the immune system. We've got other things that are perhaps within only a year or two of moving into clinical trials, or in some cases are, like, for example, the removal of amyloid in the brain in Alzheimer's disease. That already works with the immune system, but we need to remove amyloid in other tissues as well. So these are good starts, but it's very patchy right now. And chances are, I believe that we're probably looking at another 5 years or so before the more difficult therapies actually move into early stage clinical trials. So after that, what has to happen is, first of all, they've got to actually get through the clinical trial process. We've actually got to get things all the way through so that they are shown to be safe and effective. And then comes the final phase, which is combining them. We've got to actually put these things together in the same people at the same time. And inevitably, there are going to be unforeseen interactions that we're going to have to address. And so that's going to throw in a few more years of development and lag before we really hit prime time. So what all that adds up to, in my mind, is first of all, that we have a huge amount of uncertainty. Any number that I would put on the time frame is massively speculative. But I do believe, and I've been telling my colleagues for 20 years this, but maybe they'll start believing me, that we have a duty as experts in this field to give some kind of answer to this time frame question. So my answer is, I think we're about 15 years away from reaching that tipping point where things are not only individually but collectively working well enough that essentially we are able to stay one step ahead of the problem. This is a concept that I've called longevity escape velocity, where the rate at which we are improving the therapies keeps pace with the rate at which the problem is becoming more difficult within a given individual. And 15 years, but I think we have a 50-50 chance of getting there by then. I absolutely acknowledge that we have at least a 10% chance of not getting to that point for 100 years if we hit, a whole bunch of unforeseen difficulties. But I don't care about that, because a 50% chance is quite enough to be worth fighting for.
I think that's a very valid point. I'm just conscious of time, and so I think since we've got a bunch of audience questions, we'll just move over to those. So I think, Elisa, you've got them written down. Do you mind starting?
Absolutely. So one of the questions in the audience is from Alex, and obviously the research against aging is something that is fairly new, and it's definitely challenging. So her question is, what do you feel is the most challenging aspect in your work?
Well, it's a bit hard. Okay, I want to give two types of answer to that question. One simple answer would be I could just look at the various types of damage and I could say which of them is the most difficult to repair. And there, out of the 7 categories that I normally talk about, I would say there are 2 that stand out. One is mitochondrial mutations, and the second is cancer. But I think both of them are moving forward really fast right now. So I would not like to say that that's really the right answer to the question. Really, the right answer to the question is the non-scientific answer. The challenge of bringing the rest of the world sufficiently behind this crusade so that the difficulty of the science and the technological development really is the rate limiter and funding is not.
Okay, thank you very much for that. Mari, do you want to go on with other questions from the audience?
Yeah, happy to do so. So we've got a question from Cameron here. Sorry, not Cameron. What am I saying? Catherine. And that's, what's your opinion on cryonics and what do you think the future of this technology is?
Right. So yes, cryonics is a field that I believe is even more scandalously neglected than rejuvenation has been. It's a very, very valid research area. It's a research area that shows a great deal of promise, and there is, a pathetically small amount of money being directed towards the critical research areas. So, of course, cryonics is all about taking someone who has only just become legally dead and reducing them to liquid nitrogen temperatures or thereabouts, so that the obviously otherwise very rapid accumulation of additional damage in their body that it would occur as a result of their lack of a heartbeat is arrested, just like that. And the goal is to keep them in that state in anticipation that medicine will improve to the point where if they were in that state of damage in the future, they would not have been declared legally dead in the first place, because we would have been able to haul them back to health using medicine that does not yet exist. This, of course, makes philosophical sense in the context of medical progress. Everyone who has studied this at all knows that the definition of legal death, of clinical death, has had to change over the years because it became a little embarrassing that there were so many people walking around perfectly well who had been declared legally dead. And so we had to start talking about brain death and so on rather than just cardiac arrest. It is completely certain that that process will continue and that we will continue to revise the definition of clinical death. And so this is just anticipating that. The reason why cryonics has, well, there are two fundamental reasons why cryonics has been such a, has been viewed so negatively. The first one is a non-biological one, namely the fact that society does not like the idea of this uncertainty of whether someone's dead or not. They like to have this completely binary thing where someone goes instantaneously from being definitely alive to being definitely dead with nothing in between. And they don't like to listen to the medical profession telling them that no, that's nonsense, and actually it's a process of rapidly accumulating damage and we just don't know. We call someone legally dead when we give up rather than when anything has become true. The second thing is, of course, a very medical one, namely that the process of cryopreservation creates additional damage in the body over and above the damage that caused the person to be pronounced legally dead in the first place. And historically, that damage has been enormous because it has consisted of ice crystal formation that causes vast amounts of damage throughout any biological tissue, such that there is no way on God's earth that you would ever be able to revive this person by warming them up, however good your future medicine might be. In something like 25 years ago, by the development of a kind of sophisticated cocktail of cryoprotectants that caused the body not to lyse, but rather to form a glass, essentially, an amorphous solid. So for that reason, the process is called vitrification. That's done, and that is standard in cryonics practice and has been for a long, long time. Therefore, what remains is the residual damage that does still occur, even if crystallization does not occur. And that comes in two forms, essentially. The toxicity of the cryoprotectants, which is very slight, but you have to use these cryoprotectants at really high concentrations, so that matters. And secondly, the fracturing that happens, large-scale cracking of biological tissue that occurs as a result of the sheer biophysical aspect, the thermal stresses that are brought in during cooling. Both of those problems are within reach of pretty much complete solution at this point. There is research that is being conducted, except that it's not really being conducted because there's no money for it. That makes it very plausible that this would actually be possible and that we would genuinely be able to preserve people with sufficiently small amounts of additional damage being done that they could indeed be warmed up and subjected to medicine of the future, and we'd be in a good state. Furthermore, there is an enormously relevant near-term medical application of this technology, namely organ banking. Solid organs, of course, are subject to exactly the same problems I've just described, so that you can't cryopreserve them. But with these technologies, you would be able to do so. And the enormous loss of life that occurs right now because of people dying on waiting lists for organs would be gone, because immune matching wouldn't be an issue anymore if we could have banks of immunologically matched or characterized organs just waiting for people and without any problem of getting them to the person in question, to the recipient, within hours of the donor actually dying. Yeah, so, it's horrifying how neglected cryonics is.
Right. I guess this next question it's an interesting one, because I think it was written in a slightly humorous tone, which is any progress convincing someone like Elon Musk or another high-profile visionary. But in a way, the question does make sense, because if you look at something like electric cars, 10, 15 years ago, you would have been laughed out the room to consider the fact that they would be a very commonplace thing. But it was because of the investment of someone like Elon Musk that it did gain the traction that it has. And I know that Peter Thiel, the PayPal co-founder, is an investor, but do you feel like you'd need more sort of public investors, public figures, more so than governments, to be able to push this forward in the public eye?
So it's a perfect question. So indeed, the reason why I set up SENS Research Foundation as an independent charity, which was overwhelmingly funded by philanthropy and not by government grants, is precisely because wealthy people do not have a constituency. They do not have to cover their ass in terms of what they choose to put money into. You know, private companies have to cover their ass too, in terms of shareholders. Wealthy people do not. And sure enough, that's how it's worked. So Peter Thiel, as you mentioned, was our first big donor. Starting in 2006, he started to give us $1 million a year. As time's gone on, he's moved to investing rather than donating, and that's fine. Elon Musk, of course, was also a co-founder of PayPal, along with Peter. He's more of a toys for boys kind of guy, but hey, he's doing great stuff. Some of you may know that actually just last week he announced that he was giving $100 million to the X Prize Foundation to create a prize for carbon removal, which is again an area that has had pitifully little funding when compared to the obviously far less powerful approaches of simply reducing carbon production. So this is the kind of guy, you know, I'm a big fan of Elon Musk, even though he doesn't give us any money. But yes, absolutely. It's not just Peter Thiel. We still get at least 3/4 of our funding at SENS from wealthy donors, from people like Peter. A few examples who are public, I'm not breaching any confidences here, these are all known. Vitalik Buterin, who is your kind of age almost, he's like 26. He was the founder of Ethereum, so he's got a few bob. And he's one of our biggest donors right now. And I call people like that, people of that kind of generation, I call them the children of the revolution, because like he got into this when he read my book when he was 14. And the thing is, you know, these people are going to make the most difference because they have never had to change their minds about the feasibility of rejuvenation. They grew up knowing this. Whereas, you know, older people have grown up being taught the opposite, being taught that aging is inevitable. And, you know, that it's hard to re-educate people sometimes. Yeah, I mean, there's quite a few other people like this. One of our big donors is Michael Antonoff, who was again, that kind of age group, a little older, but he was a co-founder of Oculus, as in, you know, the virtual reality thing. These are the kinds of people who have absolutely come to the fore. And yes, the more they go out and proselytize and actually promote this, the better. And most of them are not very good at that, but or at least not very inclined to it. But I can do that for them.
Right. I think in terms of time, we've only got time for one more question. Okay, so between these two, I'll go with a question on, you talked about the treatment being given from a very early stage, the idea that, you know, you don't need to wait until the damage is already accumulated to try and remove it. You can do it earlier on. But sort of what stage do you think would be the best place to start? And I guess the reason I asked that, what I had in mind was something like fertility treatments. So would you have, you know, would, in your opinion, there be a possibility to develop a treatment that would prolong a time period for fertility in women? And yeah, I guess that's it really.
Yeah, okay. So I may have spoken too fast there because I don't think you quite got it. The benefits of starting early applies to medicines of the, you know, the pre-Aubrey generation. In other words, the medicines that, hypothetical medicines that would slow down the rate at which the body generates damage, okay? If that's all you're doing and you're not removing damage that's already been generated, then the earlier you start, the more you're going to postpone the point when the damage accumulates to the pathogenic quantity, right? But if you're removing damage, that all goes away. So actually, it's better to remove damage, to start these therapies in middle age, when you've already got most of the damage that you would need to get to become sick. Because, you know, then you're benefiting from all of the research advances that have occurred in the meantime, right? And you haven't lost anything because you can remove the damage anyway, right? So yeah, I think of rejuvenation as really, as damage repair, as really the sweet spot between prevention and treatment. You know, it's preventative in the sense that we apply it to people who are not yet sick, but it's treatment in the sense that we revert them back to a biologically younger age.
All right, thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Aubrey. Unfortunately, I think that's as much time as we have for today, but thank you all so much for coming to this event. And again, thank you to Aubrey for giving giving us his time and for such an insightful talk. I also want to take
Thank you all for having me.
I also want to take the opportunity to thank the BSMS Research Society and the Sussex Biomedicine Society for co-hosting this event with us.
And we mentioned earlier that we've got more talks like this. Next week, we'll be hosting former president of the Academy of Medical Sciences, Professor Sir Robert Leckler. And he'll be talking to us about the NHS and medical research after Brexit and the future of organ transplantation. You can find more details about that on our Facebook page, and I very much hope we'll see you there. Thank you again to Elisa, to Alex, and of course, Aubrey, and to all of you. And that's it from us. Thank you for coming along, and good night.